Welcome to Revolutionary Gazette. I'm Will. Welcome back to our series on dyeing in the 18th century. We're at Colonial Pennsylvania Plantation with Eva Mergen again, who helped us kick off the series. And we want to say thanks to Alfam for introducing us out here so we can have a great time with this. Eva, we've talked about dyes from the garden, and you're about to take us a different direction. Where are we going?
So we're going to something called vat dyeing. This is much more of a chemical process, whereas when you're dyeing from the garden, it's more like making a tea and putting your yarn into that tea. This requires a complicated chemical process.
So Eva, we've said the dye garden, and this is a different type of dyeing. Let's start. What are we dyeing and where does it come from?
Okay, so we are dyeing with indigo pigment. And indigo pigment comes from a number of different plants, indigo being one, which is grown in tropical regions, South America, Southeast Asia. But you can also get this pigment from the Weld plant, which grows across Europe. And this is the pigment that comes out of the plant. You need to extract the pigment from the plant before you use it. So this is the way it would have come in the 18th century.
Well, let me stop you. You said we've got Weld in the garden.
Yes.
And this is something different. Why are we going somewhere else?
The pigment like this is an easier process than going, like it's a really complicated process to get that pigment out of that plant. That's left to professional dyers. And to use the indigo plant, you get a lot more pigment for the amount of plant material that you have.
Great. And you said it grows in warm climates, so we can't grow indigo here.
You can't grow indigo here, but in South Carolina you can.
Okay, and talk to me about that as an economic crop in the era.
Yeah, so in the 18th century, South Carolina was looking for a good cash crop that grew well in that area, and their climate ended up being really good for indigo, so they were producing quite a bit of indigo in the latter part of the 18th century.
Fantastic. Well, give us an exposure today. What does it take, and how do we get that wool?
So the thing about the pigment here is it's actually not soluble in water. If I mix that pigment with water, I just get pigment floating in water. It looks like this.
I see the top's a little scummy. Is that the pigment there that we see?
Yeah, it's just sitting on top. Yeah.
So what happens if I put wool into there?
It would come out a little bit blue, but it would really just be particles sticking to the wool that you could wash right off.
Okay.
In order to get those pigments to bind with the wool, we need to go through this chemical process. In the 18th century, that pigment was soaked in stale urine. It's the perfect environment. It's got the bacterial action. It doesn't have a lot of oxygen in the solution, which is what we're looking for. And it's the perfect environment for indigo.
So we're talking save the chamber pots.
Oh, yes, we're saving the chamber pots. Absolutely. Dyers in the 18th century would have a pot outside for deposits to be put in that people could come and make their contribution.
What happened after the chamber pot is emptied? How long do you wait before you can use it?
So the urine has to sit for a few days at least. I have never done that process, so I can't speak from personal experience, but it's got to sit for a while. You've got to get that bacteria, removing the oxygen and changing it to a very highly alkali solution. Now,
to be safe in the 21st century, interpreting the 18th century, what's in the place of stale urine?
So in the place of stale urine, I have added a small amount of lye to the water, which is going to bring it to that alkali state. And I've added basically powdered urine, which is Thiourea Dioxide. It's the same chemical structure without the other stuff.
Well, let's get into it. What's the process here?
Okay, so once we've soaked that indigo pigment in the stale urine, a lot is happening in there. So that pigment is being converted to a form where it can bond with the dye. But in the process of that happening, it actually loses a lot of the blue color. So you can see the amber color in this jar here. And so the indigo pigment is in there, it's just not blue right now.
Okay.
We've got to be really careful with this because if we incorporate oxygen by stirring it, by jostling it, by dripping in it, that indigo is going to react with the oxygen, and then again, it's no longer going to bind with your fabric.
So what do we do here?
We're very, very gentle. So we're going to take this and we're really gently going to pour this into the...
Look at that color.
And if you can see, I'm down below the surface so that I'm not making bubbles as I go.
And what is the scum that's sitting on top there?
So the scum is little bits of indigo that are reacting with the air and turning blue. And you'll see that around the edges of the bowl here as well.
Wow.
So you'll see that that oxidation process happening. So now we're all ready for this to be used with the.
And we're going to make blue out of this.
We're going to make blue out of this yellow, and it's a pretty cool process. So what we're going to do is we're going to put our yarn in, and again, I'm going to put this in very carefully, very gently, to make sure that I'm not getting any bubbles incorporated.
So you want to make sure we don't introduce oxygen to this.
We don't want to introduce oxygen.
And to my eye, that's almost looking like it's taking on a green hue here.
Yeah, it's going to be greenish yellow depending on how much oxygen I'm inadvertently introducing here. So we're going to let that sit in there for just a minute. And so right now that pigment is bonding with the yarn. And the really great thing about indigo is because of this chemical process, that bond is far stronger than almost all other natural dyes.
So more fast?
Yep, more fast. It's going to last longer. It's not going to be as inclined to wash out or sun bleach out.
Okay. Okay, so you've got the wool in the indigo. Now what?
Yep. So the wool is in the indigo, and it's got a yellow color to it. What's going to happen is I'm going to pull it out. It's going to oxidize in the air, and it's going to take back that blue color that I had originally.
Okay.
So we're going to do this here. Again, as I take it out, I have to be very careful not to introduce a lot of oxygen to that solution.
So you're dripping over there to not create bubbles
so I'm not
here.
putting bubbles in here. We're going to squeeze out some of that water. I'm going to get my hands all blue because it does blue dye skin, but you can see it's turning. And we're going to lose that sort of green color in there the longer it's in the air.
Now, if I wanted that darker, what would I do?
If you want that darker, we've got to go in again and out, or make your dye bath stronger to start with.
Okay.
So now we've gotten almost all the way to blue here.
That's fantastic. Just seconds ago, that was natural colored wool.
Yep. It's a really fun process and a really good process for putting color into fabrics.
Okay.
And the nice thing about this dye is that this dye works equally well on cellulose, which are plant fibers like cotton and linen, or on protein fibers, which are wool and silk.
Okay. Great. So thank you for sharing that with us. Well, Eva, we've got blue. I think we've got a surprise coming for everybody. Stay with us just a second. We're going to use Vat Dye in a different way in just a moment. Well, Eva, we're back. I see we have the indigo here, and we just finished dyeing with Weld. We get this yellow.
Yep.
In the 21st century, I'm a big Michigan State Spartan fan. I like green. How do I get a good green here? So
a really good deep green is going to come from combining our yellow dye with our blue dye.
And what do we call this process?
Overdying.
Okay.
Yep. So we're gonna do that now. So I'm going to take this skein that's nice and yellow from the yellow dye, and we're going to do just like we did with the indigo dye before. We're going to gently drop that in, and our surface has turned a little bit blue, but underneath we're still good.
Is that for how long it's sat out open to the air,
like
we talked about?
Yeah, that's being open to the air. So I'm going to pull this out like we did before, and again, it is going to react and go to that nice deep green. So most natural dyes that are going to give you green are going to give you lighter greens without nearly as much of that blue hue in it. So this overdying process is going to get you really good greens. It's also going to get you really good purples.
Are there other combinations you can make with dyes?
There are as many combinations as you can imagine. So we can combine all different kinds of dyes to get a lot more subtle shades. And that is a very common process because otherwise we're really limited in our palette. But by combining Weld and madder, we can get oranges. By combining blues and cochineals, we can get purples. So we really have all different options here.
So I see we have used something that we did with a garden dye with the steeping process. We've got the second layer, which is vat dyed with the indigo. Can I combine anything practically?
Yeah, any of them. Any of them can go together. So you could, a dye that you simmer like the Weld, you could take that skein and then simmer it in another color.
Okay, now will I get a different color of fabric if I start with blue and then add yellow? Or if I yellow add blue, does that change at all?
Not so much. There might be really subtle differences, but those subtle differences could also just be attributed to the natural dyes that we're using, because it's always going to give subtly different colors. But one thing I'm paying attention to is not putting a darker colored skein into a lighter colored dye pot, because that could end up leaving a little bit of that color in the pot and making that pot not as good for dyeing later on.
Great. Well, Eva, this is fantastic. I look at something we did earlier with Bob with the Weld. I look at the indigo that you showed us with the vat dyeing, and now we're using the overdye process and we get the green in the middle.
Yeah, we've got some nice colors here.
Pretty fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. Thank you for being with us at Revolutionary Gazette. This is really fun to see. The sheep is a natural color, but in the Revolutionary War era, quite simply, we get to these three colors quickly, and there's so much more. Hope you enjoyed this basic exposure to color. We'll see you again soon.